My mom said I had to give up my apartment to my half-brother because he's starting a family. I sold it the next morning and moved without telling anyone. She said it like it was a foregone conclusion, like my life and independence were just a placeholder until someone more deserving came along. According to her, my half-brother's pregnant girlfriend needed a stable home, and I, being single and childless, didn't really need the space. The words stayed with me long after she left, not because they were shocking, but because of how familiar they felt, as if this was simply the continuation of a pattern I had ignored for too long. I had worked for years to save money, to slowly build up a life that felt solid and predictable, and hearing it reduced to something temporary made everything inside me tighten in a way that wasn't sadness anymore. It was anger disguised as clarity. The apartment wasn't extravagant, but it was the first place that ever felt like mine. I had picked the color of the walls, even though I later hated the shade and repainted them. I chose the furniture piece by piece on a budget that forced me to care about every small detail. I walked through empty rooms when I first got the keys, trying to convince myself I deserved quiet, steady ownership after years of shifting between other people's plans. There were mornings when I woke up early just to sit on the porch with coffee and breathe before work, feeling proud in a quiet, private way that didn't need anyone's approval. I had convinced myself that being responsible, being unproblematic, being reliable would eventually earn me respect. Instead, it made me convenient. When I tried to push back, my mother reacted with the same tone she always used when she wanted obedience without argument. She carried this certainty that she had the authority to decide what I owed, as if every sacrifice she expected was part of some unwritten agreement I never remembered signing. My half-brother made it worse in his own way, moving through the apartment with casual ownership, inspecting rooms like he already had plans for them. I noticed how his eyes slid over my belongings, not with appreciation, but with appraisal, as if my life was a set of objects waiting to be reassigned. Watching him map out my living room felt surreal, like I was watching someone erase me in real time. I went to bed that night without turning on the television. The apartment felt smaller than usual, heavier in the air, as if the walls themselves had become temporary. I lay awake staring at the faint shadow of the ceiling fan, feeling my pulse in my jaw, realizing how quickly people can decide that your life is expendable when they think they've found something better to replace it with. What bothered me most wasn't that they wanted the apartment. It was that neither of them considered the possibility of asking. They assumed my life existed to be redirected, rearranged, donated when a more important life emerged. The anger didn't come all at once. It built slowly, tightening each time I replayed their words in my head. I thought about every holiday where I was expected to show up, bring food, do the work no one else wanted to do, and pretend I didn't notice that appreciation was always conditional. I thought about how often they made plans around me, never with me, because my presence was assumed, not requested. The expectation was that I would always bend, always adjust, always move out of the way. I had spent so much time learning how to adapt to other people that I never noticed how deeply it had become a requirement. At some point in the night, I stopped feeling wounded. The grief burned away, leaving something sharper and quieter in its place. It didn't feel like revenge, not in the dramatic sense. It felt like survival, like stepping off a path that had been dragging me forward without my consent. I lay there imagining the apartment empty of me, but not in the way they wanted, not repurposed for someone else's convenience. I pictured it being wiped clean of every trace of me by strangers who didn't know the history, who didn't care about the arguments or the entitlement that had seeped into its corners. It felt oddly satisfying to imagine my absence as a disruption rather than a surrender. The decision formed without ceremony. I didn't stand up or pace or cry or talk myself into anything. I just understood, with a level of certainty I hadn't felt in years, that if I didn't leave now, I would spend the rest of my life being moved like a piece of furniture between other people's needs. The idea of staying, of arguing, of negotiating felt exhausting. I didn't want to spend another year trying to convince people who never listened that I mattered. I didn't want to see the apartment slowly transformed into a place where I once existed but didn't belong anymore. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that they had no idea what I was planning. They assumed my compliance so completely that they didn't bother paying attention to my reaction. They treated my silence as surrender, not strategy. It was strange how quickly the fear of disappointing them dissolved once I realized they didn't care about me beyond what I provided. The idea of leaving didn't feel reckless. It felt overdue. I got up before the sun rose. I walked through each room, not to reminisce, but to take stock of what truly mattered. There were things I had kept out of habit, things I thought I might need someday, things that had sentimental value long after the sentiment faded. Letting go of them felt less like abandonment and more like pruning. I opened closets and drawers, not with the frantic energy of someone escaping, but with the deliberate sorting of someone shedding weight. I realized I had built a life designed to be acceptable rather than fulfilling. I bought neutral furniture because it was practical. I decorated sparingly so no one would call it cluttered. I chose routine over joy because it was easier to manage. I had packaged myself into something unthreatening, dependable, predictable, hoping stability would somehow transform into belonging. But belonging doesn't come from shrinking yourself down to fit into other people's expectations. It comes from creating a life rooted in your own agency, even if no one else approves of it. I made coffee and drank it slowly, watching the light shift across the floor as morning arrived. The apartment looked calm, unaware of how close it was to becoming a battlefield. There was a moment where I wondered if I was overreacting, if I should compromise, negotiate, try once more to explain how unfair it felt. That instinct passed quickly. I had explained myself for years, in small ways, in bigger ways, always hoping to be heard. Silence felt like the only language they would understand. By the time the sun fully rose, I wasn't uncertain anymore. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't thinking about consequences or future arguments or accusations waiting on the other end. I was thinking about space, freedom, privacy, the relief of waking up in a place where no one could show up and tell me to move. The anger that had kept me awake softened into something steadier, a decision that felt less like an escape and more like a reclamation. I didn't pack anything that morning. I just made the choice. The rest would come later. But as I sat there, finishing my coffee, I understood with absolute clarity that the life I had built was mine to dismantle. I didn't know a single explanation for doing so. The next morning didn't begin with panic or second thoughts. It began with the strange calm that settles in when a decision no longer feels theoretical. I woke up with the same certainty I fell asleep with, but it sat differently in my body now, heavier, more solid, like something that had roots instead of adrenaline. The apartment looked untouched, quiet, and neutral, unaware that everything inside it was already being weighed for departure. My half-brother's plans were still floating somewhere in the air, like the echoes of a conversation that believed itself final, but they felt irrelevant now. They didn't know what my silence meant. They never did. They interpreted quiet as surrender, but quiet has a way of becoming strategy when you're done arguing. I needed to see them again, not because I wanted to plead or negotiate, but because I couldn't stand the idea of slipping away without letting them reveal themselves fully. I wanted to witness their entitlement without disguising it, to see how confidently they laid out plans for a future built on the assumption that I would fold. It wasn't about catharsis. It was about clarity. Sometimes you need a moment to confirm that the bridge you're about to burn was never going to lead anywhere worth going. I didn't tell him I was coming. I walked into my mother's house unannounced, the same way she used to walk into my life and deliver demands disguised as declarations of love. The air in the living room was warm and stale, heavy with leftover food and the kind of clutter that comes from people who believe their mess is someone else's problem to solve. My brother was there, sprawled on the couch with papers and catalogs spread out like he had already begun drafting renovation plans. He didn't look up with concern or curiosity. He looked up with the lazy confidence of someone expecting compliance. There was a pamphlet for paint swatches on the coffee table, open to soft pastel colors. It made my jaw tighten to see my home already being redesigned in his head, not because of sentimentality, but because of how casually he believed he had the right. My mother entered from the kitchen carrying a mug of tea and a look that suggested she assumed the previous night's insistence had settled deep enough in my conscience to guarantee obedience. She didn't greet me with warmth or hesitation. She simply acknowledged my presence, as if it marked the beginning of a conversation already decided. Neither of them asked if I had thought about their request. They asked when I planned to clear out, as if the timeline was the only variable left. I answered with facts, not explanations. I told them I didn't owe them anything, that my apartment was not a communal asset, and that their sense of entitlement didn't make my independence disposable. My words landed without impact. My mother responded with the same rehearsed disappointment she had perfected years ago, the kind that implied moral failure on my part rather than emotional manipulation on hers. She said I was being dramatic, selfish, ungrateful. She didn't want to hear motivations. She wanted obedience dressed as loyalty. My brother leaned back and laughed, not because anything was funny, but because he had always found confidence ridiculous when it came from someone who wasn't him. There was a moment where I felt heat rise in my chest, the kind that signals an argument neither person will remember accurately afterward. But I didn't want to fight. I didn't want raised voices or accusations or attempts to justify the value of my own life. They weren't listening. They had never listened. Every sentence out of their mouths assumed my compliance. Every expectation was built on a history of me bending instead of breaking. Continuing to talk would have been like shouting into insulation. Pointless, muffled, exhausting. So I stopped talking. I nodded once, a gesture they interpreted as surrender, and I stood up. They believed that nod meant I had agreed to think about it. What it actually meant was that the conversation was no longer necessary. I walked out of the house without looking back, without waiting for another comment, without giving them the satisfaction of an argument they could twist into evidence of my cruelty. Silence wasn't passive. Silence was tactical. The rest of the day blurred into movement and logistics. I didn't have the luxury of being emotional. I had to work through a checklist with precision, because once I set things in motion, there would be no room for hesitation. I gathered every document tied to ownership. Mortgage statements, tax records, insurance paperwork. The maintenance history I kept organized in a binder because I always assumed preparation was a requirement for respect. It was ironic how all the evidence of responsibility I had accumulated was about to be used not to argue, but to detach. I emailed the realtor I had worked with when I bought the apartment. It was early, barely 9, but she replied within minutes. She remembered me clearly, probably because I had been cautious, thorough, and painfully earnest during the initial purchase. She had described me back then as someone who wanted certainty more than risk. I wonder what she would think now, seeing me dismantle stability with such decisive speed. I sent photos of every room, not polished or staged, just honest documentation of a space about to be emptied of meaning. I didn't feel sentimental taking them. I felt efficient. The rest of the night was spent sorting through drawers, cabinets, closets, containers of forgotten objects that had attached themselves to the edges of my life. I held on to documents, sentimental items, clothes I actually wore, the small collection of books I hadn't yet convinced myself I would reread someday. Everything else was just noise, clutter disguised as comfort. I made piles without hesitation. Keep, donate, trash. The apartment grew lighter with each decision, as if the walls themselves were exhaling. There was no pacing, no crying, no dramatic collapse in his self-doubt. The shock had faded. The hurt had evaporated. What remained was focus, maybe even relief. I had spent so long trying to make myself indispensable, thinking that belonging would earn protection. But being indispensable had only made me useful. And usefulness is the most fragile form of love. I booked a flight without checking prices or schedules. I didn't care where I sat or what time I landed. I just needed distance. A new city, a small studio, a neutral space to rebuild without oversight. I hired movers for same-day pickup, paying extra because freedom sometimes costs more than captivity. I didn't announce any of it. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't negotiate timelines or share updates. I let the silence settle around me, heavy and intentional. Night came again before I realized how long I had been in motion. The apartment looked unfamiliar now, not because it was empty, but because it was honest. It reflected nothing but what I actually cared about, stripped of performance, stripped of preparation. I sat on the floor with a plate of leftover takeout, eating in the half-dark because I had already packed the lamps. There was a strange peace in it, a quiet acceptance that this would be my final night here, not stolen or surrendered, but chosen. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wait for messages. I didn't anticipate the fallout. I knew it would come, loud and indignant, filled with accusations of betrayal and abandonment. But that would be later. For now, there was only exhaustion, clarity, and a future expanding in small, unfamiliar directions. I fell asleep not because I was content, but because I was empty in a way that finally felt clean. Selling the apartment did not feel impulsive, even though the timeline would have looked reckless to anyone who wasn't inside my head. It felt like the natural consequence of a truth I had ignored for too long. I woke before sunrise, not because I was excited or anxious, but because my body refused to let me sink back into the heavy fog of sleep when there was a task waiting to be completed. The rooms looked different in the early light, flatter and quieter, as if they had already detached from me. The shadows on the walls didn't feel familiar anymore. They felt temporary, like the last traces of a life that was already dissolving. I had a message from the realtor waiting for me when I checked my email. It included a cash offer from a buyer who wanted a quick closing and didn't care about the furniture or the timeline. The numbers were better than I expected. They weren't life-changing, but they were freeing. The buyer didn't need a walkthrough or a long negotiation. They wanted the space immediately, clean and simple, and they didn't care about what was left behind. I read the offer 3 times, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to imprint the feeling of momentum on myself, to let it replace whatever uncertainty still lingered. I signed the paperwork electronically, my hand steady in a way that surprised me. There was no ceremony, no gratitude, no sadness. Just a signature, a timestamp, and a small confirmation message that would eventually mean my keys belonged to someone else. With every digital line drawn, something inside me loosened. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like removing a weight I had been balancing automatically for so long that I had forgotten it was heavy. The next steps were physical, and physical work is grounding in a way emotional work never quite manages to be. I opened suitcases and boxes, taking only what mattered because I didn't want to drag the past into the future out of fear. I packed clothes methodically, rolling them the way I had learned from travel videos, saving space without thinking too much about it. I chose neutral clothing first, basic pieces I wore often, not because they were fashionable, but because they were comfortable. The rest of my wardrobe stayed in the closet, a collection of items I had kept because they made me feel like someone I thought I should be instead of someone I actually was. Documents went into a folder that I taped shut twice, the edges neat and secure. I put it in the bottom of my suitcase, not because I feared losing it, but because the act of securing it made the transition feel controlled. Sentimental items were harder, not because they triggered nostalgia, but because I had to decide which memories were worth keeping in the shape of physical objects. I chose photographs, small handwritten notes, a handful of items that already meant something without having to justify their presence. I left behind the souvenirs of people who had faded from my life long before I realized it. I didn't need reminders of temporary bonds disguised as permanence. The furniture stayed. The bed, the couch, the table I had assembled with shaky hands on the night I moved in, all of it belonged to the buyer now. It was strange how easy it was to detach from objects that had once felt like symbols of success. They weren't symbols anymore. They were just things that had served their purpose. The apartment felt lighter without them, even before they were physically gone. I booked a flight using points I had saved without really intending to use them. I chose a city I had visited once, briefly, for a work trip that left me with a strange sense of possibility instead of dread. I didn't research neighborhoods or amenities or reviews. I didn't try to optimize the move. I just needed somewhere that didn't come with expectations attached. The studio I reserved online was small, barely room for a bed and a desk, but it had large windows and white walls and no history. That was enough. I called a moving service even though I wasn't taking furniture. I needed professionals to clear out what was staying behind, to strip the apartment faster than I could on my own. I scheduled them for the afternoon, knowing I would be gone by nightfall. The man on the phone sounded tired, bored, uninterested in anything except dates and addresses. His indifference was oddly comforting. I was just another job, another space to empty, another life changing without fanfare. The hours between preparing to leave and actually leaving stretched in a strange, unhurried way. I walked through each room not to reflect, but to verify that nothing essential was left. I checked outlets, drawers, cabinets, my hand moving automatically, muscle memory built from every move I had made before this one. When I opened the bathroom cabinet, I found an old bottle of perfume that I had forgotten about entirely. It smelled like a version of myself I didn't recognize, something manufactured to feel feminine and attractive instead of authentic. I threw it in the trash without hesitation. I didn't eat breakfast. I wasn't hungry. The only thing I felt was an unsteady mix of exhaustion and clarity, the kind that makes it hard to tell whether you're running towards something or simply away from everything else. I sat on the floor with my back against the empty wall where the couch had once been, and I listened to the sounds outside. The distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere, the faint hum of someone's television through the wall. The building had its own pulse, its own routines, its own small network of lives happening simultaneously. I realized how little of it had to do with me. I had lived here for years, and I recognized none of it intimately. I had been alone in a space that never quite absorbed me. When the movers arrived, they worked efficiently, ignoring me except to ask where to leave the keys. I told them to give them to the realtor. They didn't ask questions. They didn't care why I was leaving or where I was going. Their presence made the transition feel real in a way paperwork never could. The sound of furniture being moved, dragged, disassembled, carried out the door echoed through the rooms, hollow and final. Every scrape against the floor, every thud, every burst of muted conversation between workers felt like part of the dismantling. I sat on the kitchen counter with my phone in my hand, not checking messages or scrolling through news. Just holding it, feeling its weight, knowing I would turn it off soon. There was a freedom in the idea of silence, not as avoidance, but as refusal to participate. People always assume silence makes you unreachable. Sometimes it makes you ungovernable. The apartment was empty by mid-afternoon. Not spotless, not polished, but stripped of identity. The walls were bare, the floors dusty, the rooms echoing with sound in a way they never had when filled. I took one last walk through, not to sentimentalize the moment, but to confirm closure. The space no longer held any trace of me. It could become anything now for anyone. I didn't feel grief. I felt relief. I left the keys on the counter, closed the door without looking back, and walked out with one suitcase, a backpack, and a clarity that came from finally choosing myself without apology. I didn't tell them I was moving, selling, or leaving town. I didn't send texts hinting at what was happening. I didn't make calls that could be intercepted or met with expectations. I turned off my phone entirely and let the silence speak for me. At first, the quiet felt strange, almost heavy, like the air itself was aware of the absence I was about to create. It was thrilling in a subtle, almost private way, the kind of calm that comes when no one else can reach you to manipulate or demand. 2 days later, the storm hit. My phone, which I had turned back on out of habit, was flooded with notifications. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of texts. My inbox was chaotic, a digital torrent of outrage, disbelief, and frantic questions. My mother's name flashed relentlessly on the screen. When I played the first voicemail, I heard the same mixture I had grown used to: sobbing, guilt-tripping, shrill accusations, all layered over a tone of outrage that expected immediate compliance. She alternated between lamenting how selfish I was and demanding explanations that she already assumed would satisfy her moral calculus. Listening to her, I felt none of the panic I thought would come. I felt clarity. This was not about the apartment anymore. It was about control. My brother's messages were simpler, sharper. He called me a snake, an idiot, a person who ruined everything. Each message dripped with a sense of entitlement that hadn't needed articulation before. They were angry because he had lost a shortcut, a free hand in a life he assumed would always bend toward him. The apartment wasn't the loss that upset him. The loss was my compliance. They had taken for granted that I existed to make their lives easier, and for the first time, I hadn't. I read through every text, listened to every voicemail, and let the anger that had once been suppressed wash over me in a quiet, controlled way. There was no rush to respond, no emotional argument waiting in the wings. The realization that hit me was unsettling and freeing at the same time. They needed me. Not in the way families care for each other. Not in the way relationships are reciprocal. They needed me as a resource, as a facilitator, as someone to absorb their inconvenience and entitlement. My independence had never been theirs to dictate, but they acted as though it was. The more I thought about it, the more I understood the depth of their expectation. They had relied on me to maintain a balance they refused to uphold themselves. They expected obedience without negotiation, compliance without conversation, subservience without acknowledgement. My absence was proof of how fragile that reliance was. I hadn't just sold an apartment. I had disrupted the assumption that my life was theirs to commandeer. That realization was like sunlight cutting through a long, suffocating night. I didn't reply. I didn't justify myself. I didn't offer comfort or compromise. Their chaos existed without my involvement now. The relentless flood of messages and calls became background noise, an insistence that could no longer touch me. I could see clearly that the sense of betrayal they felt was not because of fairness or principle, but because my decision had stripped them of convenience. They were angry at me, but what they truly hated was the idea that my life could operate independently outside of their plans, outside of their control. I spent those days in the quiet of my new city, unpacking not just boxes but thoughts I had ignored for too long. The relief of not being constantly pulled into someone else's drama was almost dizzying. I realized that all those nights lying awake, imagining scenarios where I had to surrender parts of myself, had been preparation for this moment, for the clarity that comes when you finally refuse to negotiate your own boundaries. Every message that arrived reminded me how intertwined my past life had been with their expectations, how much of my energy had been spent maintaining the illusion of harmony at the expense of my own autonomy. But here, in the calm that was mine alone, it didn't matter anymore. Their fury, their accusations, their sense of moral high ground existed in a world I had exited without fanfare. They couldn't reach me, not fully. And the realization that they had never truly cared about me, only what I provided, gave me an unexpected sense of closure. By the end of the week, I had blocked numbers, changed email addresses, and reinforced the distance that felt like oxygen. The apartment, once a battleground of entitlement and expectation, had become a symbol of liberation. The chaos of their need, their anger, and their control had been neutralized by my absence. I was no longer a resource or a placeholder. I existed solely for myself, and that clarity, sharp and simple, was more powerful than any argument they could have thrown at me. The fallout would continue, I knew, but I also knew that it no longer belonged to me. They could scream, cry, accuse, and panic. I could remain silent, untouchable in the space I had chosen to create. And for the first time in years, I felt a quiet triumph in the knowledge that my absence was not weakness or betrayal. It was the first action I had ever taken purely for myself. I didn't plan anything clever or theatrical. There was no poetic confrontation, no dramatic declaration that changed everyone's minds. The breaking point started with something painfully ordinary: silence. Not angry silence, not the kind that simmers and waits to explode, but the empty, exhausted silence of someone who has run out of energy to justify their existence. 4 weeks after that night, I moved through the house like a ghost. Not scared anymore, just numb. My stepmom pretended nothing happened. She acted like kicking a child out into the cold was the same as grounding them for bad grades. My sister strutted around with this self-satisfied glow, as if she had won some competition only she understood. And my dad, he defaulted back into that quiet, avoidant mode, the one where he convinced himself that not talking about things was the same as solving them. Every meal was quiet. Every hallway felt tense. Every night, I went to bed replaying the same questions. Asterisk, why was I disposable? Asterisk, what had I done that made me so easy to get rid of? But the real shift happened one Saturday morning. I woke up early and went outside because the house felt heavy in a way that made it hard to breathe. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, and the frost made the porch look white and brittle. And then, without planning it, without thinking about what it meant, I said out loud, I don't belong here. It wasn't angry. It didn't even hurt. It just felt factual. True, in the simplest possible way. I didn't belong in a house where I could be discarded like trash over someone else's lie. I didn't belong with people who only cared about me when it was convenient. I didn't belong in a family that never chose me. Not once. I think that morning was when I stopped trying to win them over. Stopped trying to defend myself. Stopped explaining. Stopped hoping they would wake up and realize what they did. Something changed physically too. I ate alone. I dressed quietly. I spoke only when necessary. Not out of fear anymore, but because I refused to offer them pieces of me they never valued. And strangely, when I stopped reacting, they started to notice. My stepmom began overcompensating, offering snacks, smiling too brightly, acting like we were buddies. My dad hovered awkwardly in doorways, trying to start conversations he clearly had no idea how to finish. And my sister, she avoided me completely, which was honestly the best gift she'd ever given me. But the real pressure came from adults outside the house. Teachers, neighbors, my aunt. I didn't tell anyone what happened, but somehow they sensed it. The drop in my confidence, the way I flinched when someone raised their voice, the way I stared out windows like I was somewhere far away. One teacher pulled me aside and asked, "Is everything okay at home?" I lied automatically. "Yeah, I'm fine." But she didn't believe me, and she didn't let it drop. That same week, my aunt started showing up more often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just sitting on the porch smoking, waiting for someone to talk to her. She never asked direct questions. She just watched. She was the only adult who noticed that my smile had disappeared, that I'd stopped drawing, that I'd lost weight, and that the kid who used to talk too much now barely spoke at all. The house wasn't loud anymore. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't hostile. It was worse than that. It was indifferent. No one apologized. No one acknowledged the laundromat. No one even said the word sorry. And every day, I felt myself withdrawing further, retreating from a world that had shown me exactly how easily it could abandon me. Sometimes at night, I'd stare at the ceiling and think about how close I had come to just not waking up again. Freezing, being forgotten, being a name someone muttered once a year with half-hearted regret. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not at them, but at the fact that I almost believed I deserved it. That I almost accepted being thrown away. That I almost convinced myself the world would be better without me. That quiet, bottled anger didn't explode outward. It didn't turn into yelling or fights. It turned inward, into a vow. I'm not going to let these people define me. They didn't get to decide my worth. They didn't get to decide my future. They didn't get to decide whether I felt safe, wanted, or alive. If they could sleep peacefully while I froze alone in a laundromat, then they had already decided they weren't my family. And I was done giving them that title. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know what kind of life I would build. But I knew one thing with a clarity that felt stronger than anything I'd ever believed before. I won't stay here forever. And for the first time since that night in the cold, the thought didn't feel sad or scary. It felt like hope. It felt like freedom. It felt like the beginning of something new, something that belonged entirely to me. And that terrified them far more than anything I could have said, because they knew before I did. The quietest break is the one you don't recover from. Leaving did not happen in a dramatic burst of emotion. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no final speech that made anyone regret anything. It happened slowly, then all at once. My aunt was the first person who understood that I was done long before I said anything. She started showing up more often, asking less, doing more. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she brought clothes. Sometimes she just brought her presence, which felt more comforting than anything inside the house. One afternoon, she asked if I wanted to stay with her for a while. Not permanently, not forever, just a break. I said yes without thinking. I packed quietly. There wasn't much to take. A few clothes, notebooks, and small things that still felt like mine. No one stopped me. My stepmom watched from a distance, stiff and uncomfortable. My dad pretended not to notice the boxes leaving. My sister kept her door shut, as if hiding inside would erase what she had done. The house looked the same, but it already felt like I had disappeared from it. Moving in with my aunt was simple, almost boring. There were no questions, no probing, no attempts to dig into details. She just gave me a room, a bed, food, and routine. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. I ate full meals without feeling sick. I walked through a house without bracing for something to go wrong. Healing was slow, uneven, and not particularly inspiring. I didn't suddenly become confident or fearless. I didn't magically forget everything. There were still nights when memories drifted back and made my stomach clench. But the distance helped. I didn't have to hear anyone walking by my door. I didn't have to wonder if someone would knock or if someone would throw me out again. The fear faded, not because anything special happened, but because nothing happened. School improved slightly. I started talking again, not a lot, just enough to stop worrying teachers. I joined small activities, not because I loved them, but because they made time pass faster. My dad visited a few times. He brought snacks and acted normal, as if everything was fine. The visits were short, awkward, and hollow. He never apologized. He never mentioned the night I was kicked out, or the laundromat, or the fear on my face. He came, sat, left, and pretended that counted as effort. My stepmom never showed up. She stayed at a distance, hoping silence would erase responsibility. It didn't. My sister didn't speak to me again. Not then, not later. She carried on as if none of it existed. Years passed, and we remained strangers. Time made everything less sharp. The night in the laundromat stopped feeling like a fresh wound and became a story I remembered rather than relived. Not a nightmare, not a trauma loop, just a fact about my past that shaped me. I grew older. I became independent sooner than I expected. Jobs, school, small apartments, long walks to clear my head. Life was not glamorous, but it was stable. And stability was more valuable than anything I had ever had. The adults who let it happen continued their lives unaffected. They never faced any real consequences because most people like that don't. They weren't punished or confronted or transformed. They simply remained themselves, small, rigid, and unwilling to acknowledge their cruelty. The real change happened in me. I stopped chasing acceptance. I stopped apologizing for existing. I stopped believing my value depended on how easy I was to keep. I learned to build a life that didn't require anyone else to validate it. Not in a dramatic or heroic way, but in a quiet, practical one. A steady job, a small circle of safe people, a home where no one would ever be thrown out into the cold for the convenience of others. Sometimes I thought about going back and telling my side of the story, but there was no point. Some people never listen. Some people never change. Indifference, more than anger, was what finally freed me. I didn't forgive them. I didn't hate them. I simply moved beyond them. The laundromat became a memory I spoke about rarely, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't define me anymore. I survived something that should have broken me, not through strength or bravery, but through endurance and time. The final truth was simple. I left. I built a life far away. I never went back. And the people who let me freeze in the dark stayed exactly where they had always been. Small, unaware, and irrelevant to the person I eventually became. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel and lets us bring you more and better stories.